The German prisoner had never seen a horse this close. It snorted, wild-eyed and heavy with sweat, dust caking its flanks. The sun beat down like a punishment, branding the earth in waves of heat. A cowboy, broad-shouldered and wordless, handed him the reins. "She'll kick if you're nervous," he said. The prisoner blinked, not understanding the words, only the tone. A strange blend of warning and welcome. Around him the Texas plains stretched into a haze of golden light and red dirt. He had grown up in Bavaria, marching in step, worshipping precision. Now he stood in cowboy boots that didn't fit, choking on grit, being taught how to ride under a sky too wide to comprehend. This wasn't punishment. It was something far more confusing, and as the horse turned, muscles rippling beneath its hide, the prisoner realized this might be the first moment he had truly felt free. Even inside a prison fence, the memory of that first step onto Texas soil felt like another life. The train had shuddered to a halt beneath an indifferent sun, and the doors groaned open on a heat that struck like a slap. Dust swirled in lazy eddies along the rail yard, clinging to boots and skin and eyelids. The German POWs blinked into the brightness, the air thick with the smell of cattle dung, sun-baked wood, and something smoky they couldn't name. They had expected barbed wire and barking guards. They got silence and space. Too much space. One man whispered, "This isn't a prison, it's a desert with fences." But it wasn't quite that either. The horizon rolled out in golden waves, and the sky above them stretched so wide it felt like the lid of the world had been lifted. The town they'd passed just before arrival, if you could call it a town, looked like a ghost from a dream. A few storefronts, a windmill creaking, and a sheriff who had leaned on a wooden post, squinting without saying a word. No ruins, no rubble, no bombs, just stillness. As they were herded into trucks, the heat climbed, so different from the gray cold they had left behind in Europe. Bavaria, Saxony, the Rhineland, they had all been drenched in ash and rain. But this land burned, it didn't weep. Some of them were officers, clean-shaven even after weeks of travel, still clutching the last tatters of pride. Others were barely more than boys, their boots too big, eyes darting like rabbits. The rumors had followed them all the way across the Atlantic. Americans were cruel, their prisons lawless, revenge inevitable. But when they arrived at the camp, what they found was procedure. Clipboards, names called out with strange accents, no shouting, no dogs. The guards wore uniforms that looked more like farm clothes than military garb. One had a blade of grass tucked behind his ear. Another chewed something brown and spat into the dirt. They did not leer or mock. They simply checked names and gestured forward. Beyond the gates, the camp revealed itself in pieces. Wooden barracks, spaced in neat rows, like a cattle ranch more than a prison. A mess hall, a water tower, laundry lines strung like spider webs between posts. The fences were real, and the guard towers manned, but the air was not thick with menace. It was thick with heat, a dry, humming, oppressive kind of heat that made your bones feel hollow. Inside the barracks, the floors were swept. Blankets were thin but folded. Soap had been left in small chipped dishes by each bunk. One prisoner picked his up, sniffed it, and laughed bitterly. "American hospitality," he muttered. But no one replied. They were too busy staring at the ceiling fans turning above them in lazy circles. Cattle moved somewhere beyond the fence. Their lowing drifted through the camp like distant thunder. The sound unnerved the men more than the silence had. In Germany, war was everywhere, in the skies, in the streets, in the bones. Here it felt impossibly far away, as though it had been misplaced. There was no rubble, No collapsed roofs, only sun and dust and cattle and cowboys who spoke like they were chewing the words before spitting them out. One German officer stood by the window of his bunkhouse that first evening, arms crossed, watching the sun drop like a stone behind the prairie. "They think they're civilizing us," he muttered, "but this is something else." He wasn't sure yet if it was kindness or mockery, maybe both. At dinner they were served beans and cornbread. Coffee followed, real coffee, not roasted acorns or burnt barley. It smelled like something out of a forgotten life. A few refused to eat. Pride still outweighed hunger. But others, eyes hollow and cheeks sunken from the journey, gave in. One by one, the resistance began to soften, not from fear, but from bewilderment. The Americans didn't gloat. They didn't punish. They simply offered plates and moved on. No one had expected this. And in the quiet of that first night, as the cicadas hummed and the cattle groaned in their pastures, the prisoners began to ask themselves something more unsettling than, "What happens next?" They began to ask, "What kind of place is this?" They had survived the war, but they had not expected to be deposited in the middle of a desert, taught to stand in line, sleep on clean sheets, and eat food prepared by men in wide-brimmed hats. It felt like a mistake, or perhaps the beginning of something no one had prepared them for. The barbed wire was there, yes, but it held back something more than men. It fenced off a new kind of confusion, one where nothing made sense. Not yet. The next morning they were woken before the sun had fully risen. The light was still blue-gray, the air surprisingly cool, though the heat lay waiting just beyond the horizon like a coiled snake. A guard opened the barrack door and said a word most of them didn't recognize. "Work." He motioned with a nod, and the prisoners shuffled outside, boots dragging, eyes still bleary. Some expected a work detail, digging trenches, hauling timber, something punitive. What they got instead were horses, real ones, massive muscled animals snorting clouds into the morning chill, reins jingling, tails flicking at invisible flies. For a moment, no one moved. The Germans just stared. For many, it was their first time seeing a horse up close. One of the men, Heinz, a radio operator from Dresden, reached out to touch the flank of a chestnut mare. The horse turned, ears back, and let out a warning huff. Heinz yanked his hand back like he'd touched fire. The cowboy holding the reins gave a quiet laugh. "Ain't no porcelain doll," he muttered, then added, "You scared, she'll know." Of course, Heinz didn't understand a word, but the tone, calm, amused, not unkind, spoke volumes. That morning, confusion outpaced fear, but just barely. They were led into an open paddock, a corral ringed with sun-bleached fencing and dust so fine it hung in the air like smoke. A group of cowboys waited there, leaning on fence posts, chewing tobacco, watching the prisoners with the blank, appraising gaze of men who measured everything by how it moved, not what it claimed to be. These weren't guards in uniform. These were ranchers, rough-skinned, quiet, and precise. They carried lassos and wore spurs that jingled when they walked. One German muttered, "Bandits," under his breath. Another corrected him, "No, cowboys." The training didn't begin with instruction. It began with observation. The cowboys would mount, ride in slow loops, dismount, approach the horses from different angles, saddle, unsaddle. All the while they spoke in that slow, dragging English that sounded like a song with too few notes. The Germans watched, then copied, badly. One man tried to mount from the wrong side and earned a hard stare from both horse and cowboy. Another held the reins too tight, prompting a sharp toss of the head and a step backward from the gelding. Mistakes weren't punished. They were corrected, wordlessly, with nods, hand gestures, and the occasional clap on the back that somehow said, "Try again." The sun climbed. The dust thickened. By noon, shirts clung to backs, and every man carried the scent of leather, sweat, and sunburn. And yet a strange rhythm began to emerge. The men who had once carried rifles now carried feed buckets. Those who had shouted orders now whispered to horses, learning which ones spooked, which ones bucked, which ones tolerated clumsy hands. A kind of respect began to form, not just for the animals, but for the men who knew them. The cowboys didn't care about ranks, medals, or uniforms. They cared about posture, patience, and whether or not a man listened when a horse warned him with its ears. At some point, no one could say when, the wire stopped feeling like a cage. The open land beyond the stables stretched wide, sunlit, brutal in its beauty. But in that space, riding alongside a man who said nothing but tipped his hat when you stayed upright through a trot, there was something that felt eerily like freedom. The paradox bit deep. Prisoners in name, and yet their lungs filled with open air, their hands held reins, not rifles. The camp, the war, the Reich, all felt suspended, like dust kicked into the wind, waiting to settle. That night, as the sun fell behind the hills and the sky turned the color of old brass, the men limped back to their barracks. Their thighs ached, their hands were blistered. But no one complained, not out loud. They lay in their bunks, silent, bones heavy, minds spinning with images of hooves, snorts, cowboy glances, and dust trails curling into sky. One man, a sergeant once, whispered into the dark, "My father was a farmer, but I never learned to ride." No one replied. But several men were still awake, staring at the ceiling, letting the quiet do the talking. The war had taken much. But out there, in the dust and the sun, something else had begun to take root. Not hope, not yet, but curiosity. And that, for now, was enough. The first dust storm came without warning. The sky had been clean, cloudless, sharp with light, and then, as if pulled by some invisible curtain, it darkened. The wind howled through the camp with a sound that didn't belong to nature, more like a warning from something older. Dust lifted from the earthen walls, rolling fast, a living thing with claws and teeth. The Germans were in the pasture, learning to mend a split rail when it hit. Horses screamed and bucked, and men dropped tools to cover their eyes, coughing, stumbling, blind in a storm that turned the world red and gold. The cowboys didn't panic. They simply pulled scarves over their mouths, motioned to stay low, and kept walking. Later, as they hosed the grit from their faces, one prisoner said, "I thought Texas was trying to kill us." Another muttered, "No, I think this is Texas." The days that followed brought no mercy. The heat deepened, skin cracked, lips blistered. The sun, indifferent and eternal, watched from above as men learned to sweat through their uniforms and keep working. Boots rubbed flesh raw, palms turned to leather. When water was offered, no one spoke, only drank, head tilted back, eyes shut like it was holy. Some men collapsed once, twice. One fainted in the field, and when he came to, an old cowboy stood over him with a tin canteen and a single nod. No lecture, just water, and then back to work. But slowly something changed. The suffering didn't lessen, but it became familiar, predictable. The blister would come after the shovel, the cough would come after the dust. The ache in the thighs would follow every ride, and yet every morning the bell rang. Every morning the men rose, not by command but by rhythm. It was no longer obedience, It was adaptation. The tasks, once foreign, became muscle memory. They saddled horses without looking. They tossed hay with the same flick of the wrist. Some even began humming during chores, old German songs, half-forgotten tunes from home, now repurposed to match the rhythm of cowboy work. And then, laughter. It happened quietly at first. A man tripped over a feed trough and someone chuckled. Not mockery, just the absurdity of it all. Another day, 2 prisoners wrestled a stubborn mule into a pen, slipping in the mud, swearing in German, while the mule blinked like a bored professor. One of the cowboys, watching from the fence, let out a low whistle and drawled, "Hell, that mule's got more sense than both of you." The prisoners didn't understand the words, but they caught the tone. They laughed. So did the cowboy. And for a moment, something in the air cracked open. Water was shared more freely after that. One man passed his canteen to a cowboy without thinking. Another borrowed a cigarette and got a nod in return. The lines blurred, not completely, but enough to confuse the old categories. These weren't enemies anymore. Not really. They were men in the same heat, under the same sky, bleeding the same way when a nail tore skin, swearing in different languages when a horse kicked too close. It wasn't friendship. Not yet. But it wasn't hatred either. Hey, quick break while we catch our breath here. If you're watching this from Texas, Bavaria, or somewhere completely different, go ahead and drop a comment below. We'd love to hear where you're tuning in from. These stories stretch across oceans and generations, and if this story has pulled you in so far, take a second to hit the like button. It helps more people find these forgotten moments. You'll see a red subscribe button just below this video. Hit that and tap the notification bell next to it so we can keep sharing stories like this one. Now, let's ride back into the heat. Some nights, the silence after dinner felt different, less heavy. The men sat on their bunks, legs stretched, shirts open to the air, the dust of the day still clinging to their skin. A harmonica began to play, low, slow, untrained, a cowboy's tune borrowed by a German hand. Others hummed along, off-key. One man carved a horse's head into a scrap of wood. Another wrote in a notebook, wiping his brow between lines. No orders, no drills, just the creak of beds and the sound of a camp learning to breathe. The war had not ended. They were still prisoners. But something invisible had shifted. The Texas sun still punished them. The dust still coated their teeth. But beneath the blisters and bone-tired silence, a strange thing was beginning to grow. Not peace, not yet, but something even more dangerous, understanding. And it would not be easily undone. It started with hands, not words. A nod, a tug of the chin, fingers pointing at a saddle strap too loose, or a boot heel placed wrong in the stirrup. The cowboys had no patience for lectures, and the Germans didn't have enough English to understand them anyway. So they watched, mimicked, learned by rhythm and muscle. A cowboy would lift a bridle, glance over, and without saying a word, demonstrate how to slip it on. The German would try, fail, adjust. A grunted or the shake of a head was the only reply. Slowly the men began to mirror one another, in the way they mounted, the way they moved around the animals, even the way they squinted into the sun. Language was no longer about syllables. It was about weight, timing, posture. If you twitched too fast near a horse's flank, it would kick. If you dropped a rope too slow, the calf would dart. The horses became the true instructors, impatient, demanding, honest. A cowboy could tolerate ignorance, a horse wouldn't. One German, once a university clerk in Leipzig, spent an entire afternoon learning to rope a fence post, while a weathered ranch hand leaned against the corral rail, chewing and watching. When the rope finally flew clean and taut around the post, the cowboy gave a low whistle and said, "Not bad, Fritz." The German stood straighter, not from pride, but from recognition. He didn't know the words, but he understood the moment. Soon, a new kind of vocabulary began to emerge. It wasn't English. It wasn't German. It was something in between, born of dust and leather. Righton met cowpoke. "Gut partner," one would say with a crooked grin. Another might bark, "Schnell," cowboy, when someone lagged behind in the heat. One man, scolded by a ranch hand for trying to lift a saddle from the wrong end, muttered, "Ya, ya, boss." The cowboy snorted. "Boss," he repeated, amused. The nickname stuck. For weeks afterward they called that cowboy nothing but boss, and he never corrected them. There were jokes, too, rough ones, half understood, half accidental. A prisoner once called a particularly stubborn mule Der Führer under his breath, and the cowboy beside him, hearing the venom in the tone, let out a laugh so loud it startled the whole paddock. No translation needed, just shared contempt. The Germans began to grin more. The cowboys began to slap shoulders. They didn't need to understand every word. The rhythm was enough. In the evenings, after chores, the camp quieted into a new kind of silence. Not sullen or tense, but worn and content. Men sat on crates or leaned against fence posts, their bodies slack with exhaustion, their faces streaked with dust. Someone would strike a match. A cigarette passed from hand to hand. The smoke curled into the sky in lazy spirals. Words weren't necessary. They had spent the day communicating with reins and rope, with pressure and presence. Now they simply breathed together. Sometimes the sun would dip low, the entire plain bathed in copper light, and a few men, cowboy and prisoner alike, would stand in a loose row, staring west. Nothing needed to be said. The day was done, the horses watered, the tools stacked. There was something ancient in that stillness, a ritual older than war. A man and the land, separated by language, stitched together by labor. One evening a cowboy removed his hat, ran a hand through his sweat-soaked hair, and offered the hat to a prisoner sitting nearby. The German looked confused. The cowboy tapped his own chest, then the prisoner's head. "Too much sun," he said. The man took the hat, nodded. "Danke." The cowboy just grunted and walked off. It wasn't kindness in the sentimental sense. It was something more practical, more real, a recognition. A gesture passed not between enemies or allies, but between people who had learned to speak with motion and with silence. In a place where words once failed, the smell of leather, the press of reins, and the slow trail of smoke beneath the Texas sky said everything they needed to. So when the guards finally brought out the writing paper, real paper, folded neatly beside stubby pencils and envelopes with crisp flaps, the prisoners stared at it like it might bite. For weeks, their only communication had been glances and gestures, the universal language of labor. Now, asked to write, to explain, to confess, most of them hesitated. The paper was blank. But the lives they were living here? Anything but. Some began cautiously. "Mother, I am alive," or, "They treat us fairly." A few added, "We are fed well," and then stopped. What came next? How to explain that they rode horses now, that they could tie a rope fast as any ranch hand, that their hands, once soft with bureaucracy or brutal with rifles, were now calloused in ways their fathers would have recognized with pride. The words jammed in their throats. On the page, they looked like lies. One man, Otto, who once marched with medals on his chest, wrote simply, "They give us meat." He stared at the sentence for a long time, the graphite already smudging beneath his fingers. Meat, not sawdust bread, not powdered soup. Actual meat, grilled over open flame, served with beans that stuck to your ribs, and coffee that left grit at the bottom of the cup. He wanted to write more. About the horse he'd named, unofficially, after his school teacher, about the cowboy who taught him to roll a cigarette with one hand. But how could he? His wife was likely still boiling weeds to stretch a meal. His son, if he still lived, had never seen a horse outside a propaganda film. The guilt hit hard. They were prisoners, yes, but they were also growing stronger, sun-darkened, thick-armed, strangely whole. Their bodies were recovering while their homeland starved. The war had hollowed out entire cities. Hamburg burned, Dresden crumbled, and here they had blankets that didn't itch and water that ran cold from the tap. One man wrote to his brother and never sent the letter. In it, he described a sunrise over the pasture, the way the mist burned off as the horses galloped through it. He used the word beautiful, then scratched it out. He tried again. Strange, then peaceful. In the end, he folded the paper in half and tucked it into his boot. A few men admitted the truth aloud, not in letters but to each other, around fires, in low voices when the guards were out of earshot. One said, "I don't want to leave yet." The others didn't laugh. They didn't mock him, because they understood. Out there, beyond the ocean, was a future filled with ash and ration lines and eyes that would look at them and ask, "What did you do?" But here, under this sun, behind this fence, they were only what they did today. Fed the horses, repaired the gate, boiled coffee in a dented tin pot. It was shameful, this desire to stay, and yet it hung in the air like the smell of leather, stubborn, real, impossible to wash away. One man confessed he dreamed in English now. Short words, cowboy words. Rope, ride, hot. Another said he missed the dust when it didn't blow. They spoke of these things in riddles, never directly. To admit them was to admit that the enemy had given them something they hadn't expected. Not just kindness, but space. Space to become something else. The letters that did get sent often came back censored, lines blacked out. Phrases underlined by men in gray offices who could not fathom what was happening behind the barbed wire of Texas. One man received word that his wife had been displaced, that his daughter was missing, that his mother had died in the bombing of Kassel. He read it twice, then stared at his own letter, still unsent, where he had written about riding bareback for the first time, about the way the wind hit your face at full gallop. He burned it that night behind the barracks, not out of anger, but out of mercy. Some truths were too cruel to tell, and so the paper stayed blank for many, or filled with half-truths and gentle lies. "We are safe," they wrote. "We are working." But never. "We are becoming something else." That would take years to admit. Maybe decades, maybe never, but it was already happening. Not loudly, not clearly. Just like dust on a window pane, invisible at first, then impossible to ignore. But even as the men found rhythm in their work, even as their backs grew stronger and their calluses thickened, the war lived on inside them. It clung to their thoughts like burrs in a horse's mane. At night, when the dust settled and the plains went quiet, memories crept back in. Unwelcome, uninvited, impossible to forget. Some woke from dreams shouting orders they no longer believed in. Others whispered names into their pillows, not knowing if the people they loved still walked the earth or lay buried beneath it. Ration lines haunted them, not just the hunger, but the humiliation. The long wait under gray skies, empty bowls cradled like precious things, mothers bartering soap for bread, children licking crumbs off fingers, bomb craters outside schoolyards, fires that painted the sky, orange and ash that settled in teeth. The propaganda posters had told them it was glorious, that Germany was rising, that sacrifice was noble, but what they remembered now were the screams, the betrayals, the way the sky opened when the bombs came, and how you never really knew if your house would still be standing in the morning. Some still clung to the old language of pride and victory. One prisoner, formerly an SS courier, refused to work the line when a cowboy barked an order too sharp. He stood rigid in the dust, muttering about dignity and rank. Another called him a fool and got a punch in the mouth for it. The guards broke it up fast. No punishment followed, just silence. That night, the man who threw the punch sat alone by the fence, staring out at nothing, his knuckles raw. The man he'd struck never spoke of it again. But the next morning, he saddled his horse without a word. The cowboys, for their part, carried their own ghosts. They didn't talk about it much, but sometimes when the sun dipped low and the wind came soft off the hills, one would mention a brother who didn't come home from the Ardennes, or a cousin lost in Belgium. They didn't say much, just enough to remind the prisoners that grief wasn't theirs alone. One rancher, a tall man named Roy, who taught the prisoners how to cut wire and mend fence posts, always walked with a slight limp. One evening, a German asked brokenly, "War wound?" Roy looked at him, chewing his tobacco slow, and nodded once, then turned away. Nothing else was said, but after that, the man worked harder when Roy was nearby. Grief didn't recognize uniforms, neither did memory. Some nights, they all stared at the same sky and saw different things: a ruined street, a burning tank, a brother's coat. The war hadn't ended. Not really. It had just gone quiet, moved inward. One day, while cleaning tack in the barn, a prisoner found a photograph tucked into the corner of a saddle locker, a young man in uniform, smiling, American. On the back, a name, Tommy, 1944. He showed it to the cowboy nearby, unsure what to do. The cowboy took it gently, stared at it for a long time, and said, "My boy." Then he put it back without another word. The German stood beside him for a few minutes, said nothing, then quietly resumed polishing the bridle. Sometimes reckoning came sudden. One man, usually quiet, broke down during a storm. The wind howled, thunder cracked, and something inside him gave way. He screamed, not in rage, but in fear. He cried like a child, gripping the edge of his bunk. Another prisoner climbed down and sat beside him, arms folded, saying nothing, just sitting. Eventually, the sobs turned to shaking, then to silence. That man spoke more softly after that, ate slower, smiled more. There were no ceremonies, no apologies shouted across the dust, but there were moments, small, human ones, that chipped at the edges of something hardened. A shared cigarette, a blanket passed quietly in the cold. One day a German stumbled and dropped a feed bucket. A cowboy bent to help. Their hands touched in the dirt. Both froze. Then the cowboy nodded once and kept walking. The German stood there a long while after. Healing didn't come like a sunrise. It came like dusk, slow, creeping, softening the edges. It didn't erase the war. But it made space for something else to begin, something fragile, something real. And though none of them had words for it, they all felt it. The war still lived in them. But so did something that might, one day, take its place. The sun was already high when it happened. A dry morning, no clouds, the kind of heat that made leather creak and sweat sting your eyes before breakfast. They were working near the south paddock, saddling the horses for a fence check. Among the group was a former officer, tall, stiff-backed, known for speaking little and looking down on everything. His uniform was long gone, but the way he carried himself still clung to him like a shadow. Some whispered he'd been SS. Others just called him Commandant. He never corrected them. He rode with authority, gave orders in clipped German, and still seemed to believe there was a rank above the dust. That morning, he was assigned a stallion no one liked, a black beast with wild eyes and hooves that pounded like thunder. One of the cowboys muttered something about bad luck, but no one stopped him. Maybe they were curious, maybe they were tired, maybe it was time. He mounted well enough, stiff in the saddle, chin high. But the stallion didn't care about posture, didn't care about medals or discipline. It took less than 10 seconds, a twitch of the ear, a sudden turn, and then an explosion of hooves and fury. The officer was thrown so violently that dust plumed around him like smoke. He hit the ground with a sound that silenced everything. Men froze mid-motion. Even the horses stilled. He didn't move. For a moment, it felt like the end of something, some justice delivered by the animal itself. No one laughed. No one rushed to help. Until one cowboy walked over, slow, unhurried, and knelt. He extended a hand. No speech, no judgment. Just an open palm. The officer blinked, dazed. A cut blooming above one eye. He stared at the hand like it was a test. Then, slowly, he reached out and took it. The cowboy pulled him up with a grunt, dusted him off, and handed him back the reins. No applause, no nods, just the creak of saddles and the day resuming. But something had changed. The horse didn't recognize hierarchy. Neither, it seemed, did the cowboy. Word spread quickly, not in stories, but in fragments. Did you see? He took the hand. Didn't speak a word. Some began calling that stallion Justice, quietly, only in German. From that day on, the officer rode differently. Not badly. He was still one of the best in the saddle, but without the arrogance, without the stiffness. He listened more. He didn't bark orders anymore. When another man dropped a bridle, he bent to pick it up first. Respect, in that world, wasn't earned through threat or ideology. It came from staying on your horse or getting back on after you were thrown. The cowboys didn't treat him differently. They never had. They had only ever judged by one thing, how you carried yourself when the animal turned. The stallion became something of a legend, untamed, unbroken, beautiful in a wild, terrifying way. The Germans began to see it for what it was, not just a beast, but a mirror. The horse didn't care who you were, didn't care if you'd once commanded men or cleaned floors. It responded only to presence, to patience, to a kind of quiet that couldn't be faked. Many tried riding him. Few succeeded. But it didn't matter. The horse wasn't there to be conquered. It was there to teach. And in a place where ideology had ruled every breath, every march, every salute, the horse offered something radical, indifference. It didn't care about your past, only your balance, your timing, whether you flinched when the wind rose. The officer, no longer commandant to most, stopped trying to lead. He worked, he bled, he fell again once, got up alone that time. They say a man changes when a horse throws him. Maybe that's true. Or maybe he just sees himself more clearly, lying there in the dust, the reins still swinging, the fence line ahead, waiting to be ridden. That moment didn't erase the past, but it cracked something open, something truer than command, something no flag could offer. And for many who watched it unfold, It was the first honest moment they had seen in years. That night, the dust still clung to their tongues and hair, but something lighter hovered in the air. The kind of weightlessness that comes after a storm, not clean, not free, but quieter. The work was done, the horses fed and watered, the tools stacked in the barn's corner like old bones. The sun had melted down into the plains, and in its place the stars blinked on, slow and watchful. Someone strummed a guitar. It came soft at first, from near the mess hall where the cowboys gathered after dinner. Just a few slow chords, lazy and worn in, like boots that had walked too many miles. The notes floated across the yard like smoke, curling through the night. At first, no one moved. The Germans sat on crates or leaned against the barn walls, their bodies still sore from the day. They listened. Then a voice joined in. American, deep, slow, shaped by dust and silence more than melody. It wasn't a song they knew, but the tone was unmistakable, sorrow wrapped in something like hope. One prisoner, young from the Rhineland, his hands blistered from roping, began to hum, just softly, almost without realizing, an old tune half-remembered from before the war, a lullaby his mother used to sing while stirring soup. Another joined him, then another. Different melodies, different keys, but somehow they didn't clash. One of the cowboys looked up, met a prisoner's eyes, then nodded. Not permission, not encouragement, just acknowledgment. And that was enough. Out came a harmonica. They never learned who brought it first. One said it was smuggled in a coat. Another claimed a cowboy gave it as a joke. Either way, the sound it made was raw, wheezing, unsure, almost broken. But it had heart. And that night, under the barn roof, strung with a single hanging lantern, it spoke louder than any sermon could. The Germans sat in one corner, the Americans in another. Between them the space filled with music, awkward, uneven, beautiful. One cowboy tapped his boot to keep time. Another prisoner drummed his fingers on a feed bucket. A beat was found, notes followed, lyrics in 2 languages floated up into the rafters, not understood by all, but felt by everyone. There was no talk of the war, no sides, no flags, just voices and strings and breath blown through reeds. The cowboys hadn't meant to become anything. But that night they were diplomats of a different kind. Their language wasn't politics, it was presence. The way they offered a seat without words, the way they shared music like coffee, poured out slow, expected to be sipped, not swallowed. No lectures, no judgments, just songs that had outlived empires. One of the older Germans, a man who hadn't smiled in weeks, closed his eyes as the harmonica found a melody close to a hymn. Not exact, but close enough. His lips moved, not in prayer, but memory. Across from him a cowboy whistled the last note of a cowboy ballad that sounded suspiciously like it could have been German once, twisted by prairie winds and resung in saloons. When it ended, no one clapped. It wasn't that kind of moment. Someone coughed. Another shifted on a stool. Then slowly, one by one, they stood, stretched, wandered back toward the barracks or bunks. A few nodded good night across lines that used to divide them. No handshakes, no words, just the afterglow of something true. They wouldn't write about it in their letters. They couldn't. There was no sentence that made sense. Last night we sang with the enemy doesn't survive censorship, doesn't sit well with mothers grieving sons, doesn't fit the narrative. But they would remember it. Long after the fences were taken down, long after the uniforms were exchanged for farm clothes or factory smocks, long after the world tried to move on, They would carry that night like a matchbox in a coat pocket, small, hidden, but capable of sparking something when the cold came. In a barn beneath a lantern, with dust in their mouths and music in the air, they had stopped being prisoners and guards, cowboys and Nazis. For 1 hour, they were just men, tired, scarred, still human, and that they would never forget. The orders came at dawn. The air was cool, the sky a faint blue-gray, and the camp was wrapped in its usual hum of morning. The soft whicker of horses, the creak of leather, the clank of tin cups. But this morning, the guards didn't shout the usual roll call. They stood at the gates, papers in hand, faces unreadable. When the bell rang, it sounded different, almost hollow. Repatriation, one of the officers said in clipped tones. The word rolled across the yard like thunder that hadn't yet struck. Some men froze, others smiled with disbelief. Home. The war was over, and the fences would soon open. The announcement traveled fast. Within an hour, the camp buzzed like a disturbed hive. Some cheered, others stared at the ground. A few wept quietly behind the barracks. For months they had imagined this day, the march toward freedom, the taste of Europe again. But now, faced with it, they didn't know what to feel. Their hands, once soft, were hardened from ranch work. Their bodies were stronger, their skin darkened by the Texas sun. They had been remade by labor, by heat, by something deeper than survival. Now they were told to leave it all behind. Packing was harder than anyone expected. The guards handed out duffel bags, small and worn. "Take what you can carry," they said, and so the men gathered what little they owned. A pair of boots, cracked, but still good. A red bandana, sweat-stained from a summer of work. A carved wooden horse, whittled during long evenings by lantern light. Some had photographs with cowboys, rare, silent mementos. One man tucked a harmonica into his pocket. Another rolled a few seeds into a scrap of paper. Mesquite, someone said, or cotton, to plant when he reached home. "Texas will grow in Germany," he joked softly. But no one laughed. It was too close to truth. When the trucks came, the camp gathered near the stables. The horses shifted uneasily, sensing the change. Dust rose under their hooves, golden in the morning light. Men who had once flinched from these animals now reached out to stroke their necks. A few whispered to them in German, nonsense words, small prayers, names. The cowboys stood nearby, hats in hand, silent as stone. They didn't offer speeches. They didn't shake hands with everyone. That wasn't their way. But when a prisoner passed, each cowboy met his eyes, gave a nod, one human to another. The same wordless respect that had carried them through the months now lingered like the smell of saddle oil and smoke. One man, the former officer thrown by the stallion months before, lingered longest. He approached the cowboy who had helped him up that day. Neither spoke. The cowboy extended a gloved hand, slow and sure. The German took it. Their hands met, rough with the same calluses. The cowboy said one word, "Ride." The German nodded, his throat tight. "Maybe," he managed, and then he climbed onto the truck bed without looking back. As the convoy pulled away, the camp receded into the dust. The barbed wire shimmered in the sunlight, fading behind a haze of gold. The prisoners looked out over the fields, wide, endless, alive. They saw the fences, the pastures, the horses grazing under the open sky. Some whispered goodbye. Others pressed their palms against the wooden slats, as if to memorize the feel of it. The air smelled of leather, hay, and something else. Freedom, perhaps, though none of them could yet name it. They left as prisoners, but they did not leave unchanged. In the weeks that followed, they crossed oceans and borders. They returned to rubble, to hunger, to cities without roofs. But inside them, the plains of Texas lingered, the rhythm of hooves, the weight of sun on the back, the lesson that dignity didn't come from rank, but from how you carried yourself when the dust rose. Some planted the seeds they had taken. Some told stories that no one believed. A few hung their bandanas by the door, where the wind could catch them and smell faintly, impossibly, of sage and sweat. And a handful of them, quiet men with weathered hands, dreamed of returning, not as prisoners, but as cowboys, not to escape their past, but to live in that strange, free silence again. They never spoke of it aloud, but when they closed their eyes they could still feel it, the reins between their fingers, the dust in their mouth, the horizon stretching out forever, and the faint, eternal smell of leather. Germany was no longer the place they remembered. When the trains finally rattled across the cracked countryside and the men stepped down onto soil they once called home, many couldn't recognize it. Streets had become alleys of rubble. Churches stood gutted, bells silenced. The towns smelled of ash, not bread. Women wore grief like coats. Children no longer ran. They watched, wide-eyed, from behind doors. The men, once prisoners, now wandered through this hollowed land with calloused hands and sun-dark skin as if they belonged to another country altogether. Their uniforms were gone. Their papers marked them as free men. But they moved like strangers. Some had nowhere to go. Houses bombed, families missing, no word from wives. Others were met with relief, with tight embraces and tears. But even in those reunions, something felt off. A distance hung in the air, quiet but thick. They had survived, but not the same way everyone else had. The stories they carried didn't fit the world they returned to. "We were treated fairly," a few would say. "There was work, there were horses." But how do you explain that the place meant to punish you had also healed you? That your captors taught you to ride, to mend fences, to laugh again? That you found silence not in shame, but in sunsets on an open plain? Most chose not to try, not because they were ashamed, but because words failed, and because those who stayed behind would never understand. Some did speak, quietly, to wives, to sons, years later. One man told his grandson about the dust, how it coated your tongue until coffee tasted like clay. Another spoke of a stallion with wild eyes, and the cowboy who handed him reins instead of judgment. A few shared letters, photos, faded bandanas folded like relics, but most stayed silent. Texas lived in them, not around them. They took up lives again, or tried to. A former sergeant became a farmer. He planted mesquite in the far corner of his land where the soil was driest and told no one why. Another, once a clerk, found work in a stable where he spoke more to horses than to people. One man opened a school and taught his students how to listen before speaking, something he said he learned not from books, but from men who wore wide hats and never raised their voices. And then there were the quiet ones, the ones you'd spot in a train station or outside a village market, leaning against a wall, arms crossed, watching the world with that slow, measured gaze. Some wore boots that didn't quite match European cobblestones. One or two wore old Stetsons, battered and real. Most didn't talk much, but when they did, their words came simple and sure, like cowboys. They had returned from captivity, but they carried something deeper, not freedom in the political sense, but in the personal one. They had learned to rise after being thrown, to wipe dust from their mouths and keep walking, to measure a man not by his past, but by how he held a rope or handed a stranger a canteen on a hot day. The war had shattered them. The ranches had steadied them. Not through forgiveness or politics, but through work, through horses that didn't care who they were, through men who taught without preaching, who listened without judging, through moments of dignity offered quietly, without asking for anything in return. In the ruins of Europe, that legacy didn't shine. It didn't boast. It rode quiet, like hoofbeats in the early morning. But it endured, and if you ever find yourself in a forgotten corner of Germany or Austria, and you meet an old man who rolls a cigarette with one hand, who nods more than he speaks, and who watches sunsets like they mean something, look closer. You might just see Texas riding in his shadow, not as a memory of captivity, but as a mark of the second chance he never expected and never forgot.